Hey guys, it's great to be with you again, kind of through a video. Um, Hopefully this is the last week of this, and next week we'll be back to normal, and I'll get to be there with you. I've missed being with you these past 2 weeks, but it is what it is, and I'm looking forward to being back with you guys next week. So we've gone through. We're now on week 3 of our series called Doubt It, and we've been talking about. How do we deal with, how do we process doubt and questions that will inevitably come up throughout our faith journey. In the first week, we talked about how it's important to remember that we're not alone in our doubts. We're not alone in our questions. We're not alone in our frustrations that we feel and the tensions that we feel. We're not alone in that. We are a community where that is. Those things are okay, and we want to talk about those, and we're not alone in those. We also talked about how David in the Psalms wrote poems that kind of allow us to feel like we're not the only ones who are feeling like this, and so we're not alone in our doubts. We're not alone in our questions. Last week we talked about the idea that God does not shame us in our doubts. He does not shame us for our doubts, for our questions. We looked at Thomas and how Jesus gave him exactly what he needed to believe. And so Jesus didn't shame him. He didn't kind of scold him or yell at him or belittle him for his doubts and his questions. And so it's important for us to remember that as we have doubts and as we have questions in our faith journey, that God does not shame us. God's not mad at us. God's not looking to beat us upside the head with a stick because we have doubts and we have questions. This week we're gonna continue on this series, and if you remember, if you were there 2 weeks ago at youth group, I had you just write on slips of paper questions, doubts, things like that you have about your faith, about God, about His nature, and that kind of thing. And I've been reading through those over the past couple of weeks, and just kind of seeing trends of what we're thinking about, what we're processing, and things like that. And one of the most common things that come up, and it's not just in those papers, but it's really in our faith in general, in Christianity, is this idea of the questions like why do bad things happen to good people? Why does God allow suffering? Why does God allow really bad things happen to anyone? If God was loving and God was just, then why does He allow these things to happen? And that's a very good question. It's a very valid question, and it's one that is that people have been wrestling with. And the truth is it's not new. If you have questions like that, or if you've heard questions like that, it's not the first time those questions have been posed, and you're not the only one who has thought about that and wrestled through that. In fact, we're going to look at a story of someone in the Bible that kind of touches on this exact question, and that's the story of Job. We're going to look. I'm not going to read because you really have to do the entire story of Job, the entire book of Job, to kind of get the full picture of what's going on. And so I'm not going to read it because it's 40 some chapters or something. It's really long, and I don't want to take that time. But I want to just kind of run through, like speed through this book. But I would encourage you maybe this week to spend some time reading the book of Job. It's just a fascinating book, and it's going to leave you scratching your head, and it's going to say, what in the world? Why is this book in the Bible? But for today's purpose, and just kind of summary, Job was a righteous man. We don't know a ton about Job, where he came from. We know that he wasn't an Israelite. So he's not really the typical character that we'd have in our Bible stories. He was not an Israelite, but we know that he was righteous and that he did right. We know that he did things the right way. He was a good person, and he was righteous. And so we see this really odd scene, and we can talk different ways about this scene, and what it means and what's going on here. But basically what we see is kind of this courtroom setting where God is kind of bragging on Job and saying, he is good, he is righteous, he's doing everything right. And the accuser, the Satan in the Hebrew, the accuser tells God, like, well, of course he's going to, of course he's following you, of course he's righteous, of course he's doing these things right. Like, he's got a cake life. He's got an easy life. Things are good for him. So God says, okay, then you can go do whatever you want to him. Just don't take his life. And I'm going to show you that he is good. He is righteous. Again, super weird. And I don't want to get into discussion on that for this particular time. There's obviously discussions to be had about what that means and why that happened. But that's what happened. And so the accuser goes out and starts to do these things. And Job's life just gets miserable, man. Like pain and sickness and suffering and taking away everything that he owned, eventually his family, kids dying, and just everything is just getting worse and worse and worse. And Job goes through this immense amount of suffering and hardship and trials. And what we see in the midst of this, and what Job, a lot of the book of Job is this dialogue between Job and three friends. And the dialogue really centers around, like, why is Job going through this? Why is Job suffering? Why is he going through this hardship and this pain and these trials? And these conversations are based around this mindset of this time, where of how God operates, of who God is, of the way that he works, the way that he operates in this world, and the way that it was thought that God operated in this kind of time, in this setting, was if you do good, then good things will happen to you. If you do bad, then bad things will happen to you. And so when we do, or when bad stuff happens, then it's a result or a punishment, if you will, of these bad things that were happening. And that was the overarching kind of mindset of how God operated. And it wasn't just God, Yahweh, just in general. This was a time where there was thought to be multiple gods. And so this idea that, man, to appease the gods, you have to do good and then good will happen to you. But if you make them mad because you did something bad, then stuff like what Job was going through would happen. And so there's these dialogues between Job and these three guys, basically, that centered around how does God operate? Is that the way that God operates? And so these three friends are saying, like, Job, you're going through all this. Like, what have you done? Like, what is it that you've done? What wrongdoing, what sin have you committed? And Job sticks to his guns and, like, I've done nothing. My conscience is clear. My heart is clear. I've not done anything that is bad. I've been righteous. I've made all these right decisions. And the friends are like, no, that's not the way that God operates. If this is happening to you, it's because of something that you had done. And so Job just keeps declaring his innocence. You see, Job's experience that he was having could not be reconciled. Job wasn't able to reconcile his experience with what he had been taught, what he had grown up to believe about God. He couldn't reconcile his experience with his own understanding of the way that God operated. He thought that God operated in a way that if you do good, good things will happen. If you do bad, then bad things will happen. And all of a sudden, Job's experience was not that way. It was something else, and he couldn't reconcile that with his understanding of God. It basically said, if God is just, then what? Like, this is not God. Either two things. God does not operate on justice. God does not run this world on the principle of justice. Or two, God is just simply not just, because Job couldn't reconcile his experience with his previous understanding of who God was and how God operated. It caused these great questions and doubts and frustration and anger. And he kind of lashes out at God, we see in this book of Job, because he couldn't reconcile that. And I think that's us too, right? Like, we've grown up thinking one way or one thing about how God operates, and then all of a sudden something happens in our life, and it kind of throws that understanding that we had into chaos. Like, we can't make those two things line up because of our life experience. For me, just one instance where this happened is in the area of prayer. I had this understanding that, like, man, if I'm praying and it's this good thing that I'm praying for, and like it's the right thing that I'm praying for, and even better than that, if I have there are tons of people that are just praying for this same thing, and this thing is really good, and it's obviously right what we're praying for, but then all of a sudden that prayer is not answered. And my understanding of God was that, man, if we've got all of these things, if we're in agreement and it's good, then of course God is going to answer those prayers. And then all of a sudden in life experiences that I've seen and I prayed for, like that wasn't the case. That's not the way that it worked. The prayers that we were praying were simply not answered in the way that we were praying for them. And so my life experience suddenly didn't line up with my understanding of the way that prayer worked, the way that God answered prayers. And so I began to question that. Does God even hear our prayers? Does prayer matter? Does God change things because of prayer? And all of these things were thrown into this time of questioning and wondering, and to be honest, even doubt. And so back to Job. We flip back to this story of Job, and Job is in this time of suffering, and he's in this time of dialogue with his friends, and he's wondering, like, what is going on here? This is not lining up with the way that I thought things were. And so we're going to get this, we're back in the book of the Bible, right? And so we're going to get this great answer, right? Like, this is all going to be solved. Why is Job? What's the secret that's in there, that this is the reason that Job is suffering? What's the answer? Why does Job suffer? Why do good people suffer? Why does God bring about suffering or even allow suffering? And we're setting ourselves up for this great answer, except we just don't get it. Like, you read the entire book of Job and it leaves you with the same question. Why did this happen? It doesn't answer this question. God essentially says, there's not an answer. There's not an answer that I can give you that's going to make that question go away. There's not an answer that I can give you that is going to satisfy what you are looking for and what you are longing for. And that's the question that he gives Job. And that's the answer to the question that Job asks of him. But later, God said, like at the very end of the chapter, or the end of the book, God says, basically, Job, what you've done, what you've said is right. Not that like you're an unjust God and you're unloving, but I think what God is saying is, you're right to question this, to wrestle with it, to struggle through it. He almost gives Job this blessing for even just wrestling through this and wondering and doubting and trying to process this. So he's like, I can't give you this answer that's going to satisfy you, but kudos on wrestling through this. Kudos to you for struggling through that. What you are doing is right. So the truth is, all those questions that you wrote down on your paper, and as I was reading through those, the truth is, some of those things just, like, we're not going to get answers for. Some of our doubts, some of our questions, we are not going to get answers for. And people will try to, right? Like, we'll try to come up with these really churchy and sounding good, feel good answers to these things that makes it sound better and makes it feel better. But the truth is some of these big questions, some of these doubts that we have just simply aren't going to get answered. But can I encourage you that we still choose to trust? In the midst of the questions, in the midst of the doubts, in the midst of the wrestling and the struggling, which God seems to bless at the end of Job, in the midst of that, we still choose to trust. Sometimes even kind of faking it till we make it, right? Like, man, this doesn't make any sense, so I'm just going to say that I trust. I'm just going to say that I trust. I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust. I'm going to trust. And eventually I'm going to start to believe that I actually do trust. So as you go through these questions, as you go through these doubts, it's not the answer that I want to give you. I would love to say, man, here's the book that has all of the answers. If you just read it, or if you just study hard enough, you're going to come up with those answers. But the truth is sometimes we just don't get those answers. Can I ask you, what would it look like in your life to trust in the midst of those questions, to trust in the midst of the doubts? God, I don't know. This doesn't make any sense. This doesn't line up with who I thought you were. I don't know. I don't know what I'm thinking now. I don't know what I'm believing now. But I'm going to trust you. I'm going to trust you I'm going to trust you that your love never fails, it never gives up, it never runs out on me. I'm simply choosing to trust. God, thank you for your love for us. Thank you that you are trustworthy. Thank you that you love us. And even in times where we don't necessarily feel that, or we just don't necessarily see that, God, help us to trust. Help us to remain faithful. Help us to even surround ourselves with people who can help us to trust and help us to hold on to our faith in you. Thank you again for your love for us. Thank you for the permission that we have been given to wrestle through and to struggle with these things. Help us to do that faithfully, always clinging on to you, always clinging on to the trust that we have in you, that your love never fails, it never gives up, and it never runs out on us. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks, guys.